Hello and welcome back to Protect Life, here breaking the consensus. Before we get into the business of the day, I'd like to remind you as usual to click on the subscribe button. That means anybody who hasn't done that already, you can be advised of any new material, new videos, new interviews that we are doing. Also, as you know, we are facing into another season where we can't be doing the work we would normally do amongst you. But the campaigns have to keep going on. There are lots of pressing life issues that we want to work with. So if you can help us out with that, if you can click on the donate button there, it'd be really appreciated, and we can promise you whatever you can give will be used well. Today, I am very happy to be talking to Dawn McAvoy. Dawn works with Both Lives Matter in Northern Ireland. Dawn, welcome, and thanks a million for joining us.
No, it's our pleasure. Thank you so much. As you said, because of COVID, a lot of things haven't been happening. So it's a real pleasure to speak to you, Michael, this morning.
Dawn, for the people who aren't aware about the situation, we're coming into the end of I suppose around the first year of the new regime in Northern Ireland, a new abortion regime. For those people who don't know what the situation was or didn't know before, could you describe what the legal situation in the North had been previously, what it is now, and kind of how that came about? Give a bit of context for people.
Yes, certainly. I know we've all lost a year, so it's hard to sort of think what exactly has happened. Up until October 2019, Northern Ireland had a law that was based on the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act, which effectively restricted abortion to circumstances where a woman's life was at risk, life or death. That then, in addition, with the 1945 Criminal Justice Act, brought in the offence of child destruction. And between those two laws, there had developed, between case and statute law, the circumstance where abortion was only permitted when a woman's life was at risk or her mental or physical health in a way that was real, serious, long-term or permanent. Effectively, that meant there were very few abortions every year. It was legal, but the bar was set very high. So for a number of years, there were probably around 50 abortions a year in Northern Ireland performed in hospitals here. Now, just like with yourselves, in the Republic, there had been a pro-choice, pro-abortion campaign ramping up for years. And with the collapse of the Northern Ireland Assembly in 2017, pro-abortion activists here on this island and in GB were working together to encourage Westminster to intervene and impose abortion laws on Northern Ireland, even though the last vote in the Assembly, which I believe was February 2016, had rejected any change to the abortion law. So unfortunately, in October 2019, over the course of the previous summer, and then it came into play in October 2019, Westminster decriminalised abortion in Northern Ireland. Now that meant effectively they just removed the parts of the law that gave any explicit protection to every unborn baby. So on October 23rd, 2019, we woke up to no legal protection for any baby until they were born. We were left for 6 months in a limbo period between October to the end of March, when there was no legislation on abortion, and there was no regulation, there was no statutory regulatory framework. And then at the end of March 2020, the abortion regulations, the new abortion regime was announced, based on a CEDAW report, which was primarily Westminster's argument for imposing the legislation. So they ignored Supreme Court rulings, they ignored the court ruling in the High Court in Belfast, they ignored the democratically expressed will of our Assembly, they ignored postcards, petitions, over 20,000 people on the streets. They ignored all of that. They ignored the response to the public consultation. Over 79% of the public rejected the law change they were trying to bring in. But at the end of March, it was imposed, and it has left us with abortion unrestricted in the first 12 weeks, and then up to 24 weeks, abortion for undefined mental health or physical health reasons. And then from 24 weeks to birth, there's abortion for disability. So for the first time, we have prenatal disability discrimination in law.
Okay, just go back because something struck me. You said that after the 1945 Act, that one of the reasons for an abortion in the North could be that for physical or mental health, but within certain specific contexts.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in England and in many jurisdictions, I suspect in the Republic, it's that the mental health clause tended to end up being this catch-all thing.
Mm-hmm.
But that was avoided in the North, was it?
Yes, because in Northern Ireland, the statutory law was based on a threat to the life, literally life or death of the mother. And then in 1945, it was after a rape case, the Bourne case, where a teenage girl had been gang raped, and the Dr. Bourne, performed a termination. And then he was taken to court because it was a criminal act. Post that case, then there was an understanding in law that if I think the wording at the time was that the young girl would be a mental wreck, the impact on her mental health. But it was still read through the eyes of a risk to life. So the bar was set, and it was defined that it had to be a real and serious, long-term or permanent threat to her mental or physical health. So it wasn't, as 67 has been interpreted, that it's undefined and that the risk to mental health is worse if she continues in the pregnancy than if she doesn't, which has opened up the door to abortion on demand.
Right, yeah.
And I think that the evidence in that the bar was set so high is the fact that there were so few abortions performed in Northern Ireland.
And in fact, very few indeed. I mean, the numbers you were giving. Now, I know it must have been galling, I think, for people in Northern Ireland to see these pictures of politicians in the South with their posters saying the North next.
Mm-hmm. It was galling. It was tragic, actually. The law that we had when our campaign launched in 2017, we launched with a report that said that over 100,000 people were alive in Northern Ireland because of the different law that we had to the rest of GB. And that report was criticised immediately. It was challenged. We reported to the Advertising Standards Authority in England, and the charge was that we had misled the public, that it was offensive, our claim, and inaccurate. So the Advertising Standards Authority engaged with us for about 5 months, backwards and forwards. They looked at our original methodology. We looked at a second methodology, abortion rates and then abortion ratio. And they employed they tasked an independent health statistician to look at it. And then they affirmed our claim as a plausible conservative estimate. So it was evidence, sort of like a test tube case, that the law in Northern Ireland had a direct impact, positive impact, in lives being lived. So it had restricted, abortions did still happen for those very tightly defined legal circumstances here. And then some women did choose to travel, probably around between 800 to 1,000 a year. But the abortion rate here was 6 times less than the rest of the UK.
Now, one of the reasons why that number was important, and well, other than the simple fact that 100,000 people are alive, which is surely is a good in itself. Every human being is a good in themselves and has a moral value. And
sorry to jump in, Michael, but in the size of Northern Ireland, with sort of 1.5 to 1.8 million people, 100,000 is somebody we all know. You know, our sister, our mother, our friend. You know, so it brought it home to people. You know.
Yeah, I mean, it would be in around the third biggest city in the province would be 100,000 people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
we were looking at, we did a similar thing in the South in the run up to the repeal campaign. We looked at the numbers of people whose lives have been saved since '83 on the basis that if there had been an abortion regime in here. And one of the things that we were constantly told was, as we were always, oh, this is scaremongering and you're lying and the numbers won't go up, nothing will change. All we're doing is saying instead of having to go to the UK, instead of having to go to mainland Britain, people don't have to go through the trauma of that, and they can stay at home and they can be supported, whatever. The numbers won't change. We were always very skeptical of that, and as I imagine they were saying the same thing in the North. Nothing will change.
No, absolutely. I mean, there are always those claims, aren't they, that restricting abortion doesn't stop it, it just makes it less safe. Women have illegal backstreet abortions, putting their lives at risk. There's also the charge that life-affirming law put women's lives at risk. So yes, the same things were said by the pro-abortion activists here. And unfortunately, we could look not only at Great Britain with the exponential rise in abortion rates from 1967 through to the current day. We then could also, unfortunately, look at our close neighbours and see the rise in the abortion rate from the law change in the South. So, as you've just said, we fully expected that those rates would probably, going by other jurisdictions, at least triple in the first couple of years.
And what has the outcome been for the first 12 months? Do we know?
So we haven't got through to the end of March yet, obviously, but from some statistics that have been released, we've seen that from the end of March in 2020 through to January 21, there have been just over 1,000 abortions. In the North? In Northern Ireland, yes.
So that's in less than a year. And historically, I mean, that's a tragedy, isn't it? I mean,
it is a tragedy, because we still don't know. The abortion services here haven't been commissioned fully. They haven't been centralised. We still hear stories that women aren't accessing the abortion they want. So we can see that the abortion lobby will not be content until there is unrestricted, on-demand abortion. And in their own words, there are never too many abortions for them.
Really?
There are never too many. So their goal isn't to see as few as possible and address the reasons why a woman would feel that she needs an abortion. Their goal is to normalise, demedicalise, refer to it as healthcare. And so for them, there's just no number that is too many.
Have you noticed in the discourse that you've been hearing in the North that there's been a shift? That for years, historically, we saw in the United States and in other jurisdictions, safe, rare and safe and rare. That was the mantra. We constantly be here. Nobody takes abortion lightly. Nobody chooses to have an abortion lightly. There's been a change in the tone of the discourse there, hasn't there?
So where it used to be safe, legal, rare, it's just safe and legal. The rare is irrelevant. It's no longer seen as a necessary evil or a tragedy. It's now seen as and referred to as simply as any other medical procedure. So we've seen whether it's been in court rulings where senior judges have referred to an abortion like an appendectomy, or the head of the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, Professor Leslie Reagan, referred to an abortion like getting a bunion removed. So we've seen the language from pro-choice and abortion activists just change the tone of the conversation to completely dehumanize the unborn baby whose life is being ended, to normalize the procedure. And I think ultimately the aim, it's no longer seen as, again, from the States, that private decision between a woman and her doctor. The ultimate aim is that you don't even need a doctor involved. So when we talk about the agenda being to demedicalize, and you can see it through the at-home abortion push, so a woman will self-diagnose her pregnancy, self-date it, she'll self-refer, she'll self-administer her own medication, she'll self-assess. If she's trusted to be aware enough of her own body, if there's any problems, and then she can seek help if she needs to, but she has to monitor that herself. So the Trust Women campaign has isolated, and is contributing to the abuse of women who are left on their own in a crisis situation to be exploited by pro-abortion activists.
So I just wanted to go back because I'm slightly shocked. You said the president of the Royal College of Gynecologists and Obstetricians referred to an abortion as removing a bunion.
That was a few years ago. She's no longer, I don't believe, the president, but yes.
That was, that's a mirror inside into a mentality, isn't it?
And I think that's this, many of us as women who've had babies are obstetrician gynecologists, are midwives, were our heroes, midwives were angels, in delivery. They look after us in pregnancy, they ensure a safe delivery. And there are many, many wonderful midwives and consultants within those professions, but the colleges, the tone has changed. So there's that a pregnancy is a woman, and the unborn life bears only a relevance if the woman wants it there. So
of course, we should remember that you don't have to be a woman to be pregnant anymore. It's no longer, it's a pregnant person now.
Yes. So chest feeding, human milk. Yes.
You saw that, chest feeding. The other thing about that, and this has nothing to do with anything, but the thing that got me about that is that women have chests as well, and men have chests, and men have breasts.
And men get breast cancer.
Yeah, there's nothing specifically gendered about a breast.
No.
Shakespeare had breastplates in this, he's shot in the breast, and yet it just sounds weird. Why would a disfigurement of language, which maybe is a disfigurement of a way of thinking or something, that we now, for listeners who maybe, or viewers who don't aware of, I think it was in the south of England, around the health service in Sussex or Hampshire has now decided that to be sensitive on gender issues, that they're no longer going to be talking about breast cancer or breastfeeding. It's chest feeding. And I thought that sounds kind of creepy to me. Chest feeding.
And I think for the majority, and there have been kickback from some trans activists as well. It's a bit like an emperor's new clothes scenario. We're all just meant to comply with something that most people think is absolutely nuts, and yet it was one trust area, to keep it in perspective. But it's that dehumanization of the unborn baby. And actually, I think the abortion agenda dehumanizes women, because it makes our bodies, our biology, fertility, and our baby unborn the problem to society. And then you remove the baby, you sort out your female biology, and then you can take your place in society like men.
But like men, because ultimately the female biology and pregnancy, that's the problem. It is problematic. It's stopping you functioning like a proper man. That is a very weird place to have come after 50 years of feminism.
It's shocking, so the message that women hear is your empowerment, your equality, your freedom as a woman depends on and is defined in your ability to terminate the life of your unborn baby. So if you want to take your place at college or university, and most abortions still happen in that sort of early career age, the pressure to fit into what is really a male-oriented, biologically driven sort of strata. And the female biology doesn't fit into that. So if you get pregnant at that stage, well, then your career's at risk, your degree's at risk. And so, yes, it's giving a message that you can take your place in society equal to men, but only if your body can be like a man's and a pregnancy doesn't get in the way. Where, of course, for most women, if they could choose to do both, so if childcare was in place, if there was flexible hours, if lecturers were more amenable to extending deadlines and working around those circumstances, then lives could be chosen.
Has there been some interesting studies in the last few years, a couple of books coming out on the subject of the relationship between, say, the sexual revolution, abortion, contraception, and these things, and how they've impacted on women and men? That rather that not to go too far one side, but a suggestion that the perception that this had all been about liberation, but maybe was a mistake, and that rather what we see is that it was a way of conforming, in some ways, women to men's desires. That men could now ultimately have whatever it was they wanted with no threat of consequence. And once you had socialized in this expectation with that horrible question, well, you're not going to keep it, are you? Once that had become accepted as a response, more than accepted, I think, and this is where I think they want to go now, is rather that's the responsible, sensible thing to do. I mean, you're not going to keep it, are you? That's where we have got to. And really, that's just confirming the capacity for men, I mean, to get whatever it is they want, but with no responsibility and no threat of responsibility or consequence.
Absolutely. There's been a flip of an order of things, and that sort of pressure that is put on women to conform to what the world is telling them makes them free and equal. And you just have to look at the stories on our own website, or an example, but in other, pro-life groups are highlighting stories of, every abortion ends a human life, and many women are hurt by abortion. Many of them maybe not immediately, because they buy into that perception of freedom, and they have an abortion because they're told, it's not, there's no baby, it's just a clump of cells, whatever. They believe that. And then it could be years later before the reality of what happened, of what was done, hits them, and then the hurt starts. For other women, it begins as soon as the abortion has happened. But those voices, people don't want to hear those voices, or a pro-choice culture doesn't want to hear those voices because it doesn't fit with the agenda that they have.
I thought it was really interesting in the campaign, the debate here, when we had members of Parliament down here talking about going out for a few pints to celebrate their abortion and how little it was, because this was very much the narrative, it's not a big deal. I think more anger was reserved for those women who were talking about the hurt they experienced than almost anybody else. Mm-hmm. They seemed to attract a level of despite, which was really particular. And in fact, a number of times attempts when they in hotels to speak were closed down. Threats were made against staff and hotels. So they really do not want women to speak about this.
No, and you can see, as you've just said, you can see the anger, the vitriol. If you don't adhere to the narrative that is being presented, then you're rejected, and you're basically silenced. So it's really important that those stories are told, that we encourage women to come forward, not only because other people need to hear, but their recognition of their own hurt then is what helps them heal and helps others avoid the hurt that they themselves then have suffered from. So we would encourage, for us as a campaign, we were so focused for a period of time into defending and protecting a law that was in place. We've always talked about a trinity of laws that protect lives, services that enable lives to be chosen, and a society that affirms in culture every life, regardless of gender, age, health, ability. So that law, services, culture trinity is even more important now that the law has been changed. So we know that most abortions happen for socioeconomic reasons. Most abortions happen because the partner, the husband, the boyfriend walks away, doesn't want to know. And then a woman maybe isn't supported by her family or by her friends. So contrary to the trust women message, which isolates and abuses women, we're saying, and pushes men to the side, we're saying that men need to step up, whether that's the man who's helped create the baby, or the male friend, or the father or the brother, support this woman who's in crisis. And then collectively, we can enable life to be chosen, because most women feel if they choose an abortion, they don't perhaps feel that it's a genuine choice. They don't have the emotional support, the practical support, the financial support that they need to choose life for their baby. And they would rather do that if other people would step around and support them and journey with them in the pregnancy.
Since the change in the laws in the Northern Ireland, have there been conscience protections brought in for people who don't want to be involved in this process? What's the status? I mean, for example, I don't know in the North, are different hospitals operating under different ethoses, or all the hospitals within the National Health Service expected to provide this service, or doctors, midwives? What's the situation there?
It's a tricky one in that under the previous legislation, we didn't have conscientious objection or conscience protection, because abortion was only legal when a woman's life was at risk. So then when abortion was decriminalized, and then we knew that a new law would be being brought in, we understood, and that is what has happened, that really Westminster and the Northern Ireland office have framed this legislation for Northern Ireland broadly along the same lines as the 67 Act introduced abortion for Great Britain. So those conscience rights are similar to what we have here, but over the years they've been watered down, so that there is concern amongst medical professionals, including healthcare professionals, that what exactly do those rights protect them from whenever abortion isn't possibly a surgical procedure solely? What happens when it's a chemical abortion, when medication's being posted out, when it's a telephone consultation, when it's a remote consultation? If you're in management or leadership position, when can you opt in and opt out? So that is still broadly being worked out, I think, on the ground amongst the professionals, for them to understand what they are and aren't expected to do. And we are contacted by midwives who are asking, do I need to do this? How can I protect my conscience? So you can see that the concern is there.
It must be a dreadful position to be in, suddenly to find yourself in, if you're a pro-life midwife, or indeed,
or pharmacist,
obstetrician, gynecologist, or GP. But particularly, I think for midwives, because they're sort of directly the hands-on, they're the motive, to find themselves in a position where maybe they never dreamt that they would find themselves.
Midwives and nurses as well, for those earlier terminations. So yes, I mean, there's been a complete culture change within the hospitals. Some people obviously have welcomed it, but many others are concerned. COVID, the pandemic, has delayed the implementation of the new legislation, rightly so. Many services have been restricted and impacted. And as I said, we are being contacted by healthcare professionals who are concerned about what it's going to mean for them. We also know that some have changed fields because they just don't want to be involved. So whereas our desire would be that medics, doctors, midwives who value both lives, it's very important that they remain in those service fields so that they can be there for women who are struggling in a pregnancy crisis. And it's very important then, whenever you acknowledge a crisis that you're in, that the message you hear back is life affirming and not life denying.
I mean, that was something that came across very clearly to me, talking to a number of women who here who had pregnancies where the fetus was in difficulty, or there were issues about the health of the fetus. They said it was so important that you had doctors and consultants who were pro-life, so you felt completely comfortable that whatever would be done, that could be done to protect or to the safety and the health of the fetus would be done.
Absolutely.
That once you introduce the other side, then there was this constant concern, and also the fact that we heard many stories of people going to hospitals in Dublin and being said, well, you know, we can arrange for this. You can go to Liverpool or whatever it was, rather than being supported in the way that they wished to be and they should have been. That there was genuine pressure that they were wasting people's resources.
Yeah, there's an assumption of termination given certain circumstances, primarily a fetal diagnosis of some sort. You know, the assumption seems to be that that's a life not worth living, even if it's something that can be quite easily corrected post-birth, or if not, you can have a long and fulfilling life. The assumption is that termination is best, and you can see that in other jurisdictions.
It's something shocking, I think, that people on one side of this argument, of this debate, who spend in other ways lots of time talking about rights and human values and humanity and protecting minorities and when it comes to people, when it comes to the area, say, of unborn children with handicap or developmental problems or whatever, have this incredibly brutal attitude where simply the fact, for example, that a child might have Down syndrome is considered to be a sufficient reason, justification to take the child's life. And I don't know how you can square that with a society which then goes on and talks about disability rights and recognitions and equality of access and equality of esteem and equality of respect, when the message you're saying is to people who have Down syndrome, well, you got away, but if you hadn't, you know, that's now. Is there? I think there's a move being made in the north at the moment towards trying to form some kind of protection for children in situations like that.
Yeah, I think it's a very sensitive subject, because we've been talking generally about abortion, and we both agree that abortion based on choice, it's wrong to end the life of an unborn child at any stage, any child. When it comes to disability and abortion for disability, there's another layer on top of that, because you're specifically targeting a child, not because the mother is saying her health is bad or her circumstances aren't good. It's specifically because there's a fault perceived with that unborn baby. And of course, it's not a fault with the baby in the womb so much as the projected expectation for the life that will be lived outside the womb. So the Sally Field, Sally Field, that's the American actress, Sally Phillips, A World Without Downs a few years ago, there was that, well, who's going to look after your child? It's a very selfish decision to give birth to that child. You mentioned sort of morality. It's nearly the moral thing to do is to terminate the life of this child whose life is unworthy of being lived because of the suffering, not for that child primarily, but the suffering that you're going to feel. The burden is going to be on your family, and when something happens to you, the burden is going to be on the state. So there's that eugenic tendency, and that's very concerning.
And also,
it's also cheaper, Michael, for governments.
Oh, yeah, certainly. I mean, and that's we should. It's a cynical observation. People might say, but it's certainly true. it just seems to me, does it not, is it not the mark of our humanity, that our evolution as moral beings is precisely the manner in which we take care of those people around us who are more vulnerable, and that we are choosing to lose something central to our humanity if we choose this way?
I think so. I think it's that what sets us apart from the animal kingdom. We have the ability to reason, to care, to nurture, and that's what set apart sort of the progress from the Dark Ages, the pagan cultures, where children born and not wanted were just left, disabled children were just left, and that culture change happened whenever a new faith, Christianity, was born, and those early Christ followers saw things very differently, that every human being was made unique in God's image, not just the able-bodied, not just the boy babies. And that then culture of accepting every human being has carried through for hundreds, a couple of thousand years nearly. And then in 1967 in GB, there was in law a reason to terminate based on the wording at the time was a severe disability or handicap. Now it's fetal impairment or abnormality would be the phrasing. So in 67, for the first time, you could terminate babies based legally on their disability, which led then to that real counterculture, that change between, for example, in Northern Ireland and GB, where in GB up to 90% of babies diagnosed in the womb with Down syndrome were terminated, but not here. And Lord Shinquin, who's in the House of Lords at Westminster, in that period before the law changed here, spoke out very forcibly, saying that Northern Ireland was the safest place to be in the womb and diagnosed with a disability because it wasn't permitted here. Whereas Westminster then chose to impose their eugenic system onto Northern Ireland. And ironically, 67 was before any of the now widely lauded disability discrimination legislation was brought in 1990 and beyond. So actually what Westminster does has been questioned at the UN. The CEDAW committee, their report that the abortion legislation here was broadly based upon, they even said that there shouldn't be stereotyping and stigmatizing of disabled babies. And yet that's exactly what legislation permitting abortion based on a diagnosis does. It's prenatal disability discrimination.
Now, I hear Paul Given is looking at this issue and seeing if there are ways that the situation at the very least can be improved. Have you heard anything about that?
Yes, we have, and we're very excited about it, actually. It's one part of the whole abortion issue, but it's an issue that I don't see how anybody couldn't get behind it. So whether you're pro-choice as a label or you're pro-life as a label, surely we can all agree that children with disabilities should not be discriminated against, that their lives are worthy of being lived, that they deserve, and their families. We don't want to look at life through rose-tinted spectacles or pretend that life isn't difficult for families. I think we all know families, I'm sure, where there are children with disabilities in those families, and the families could do with more support, and those children could do with more, whether it's physical or intellectual therapies to improve their well-being. Mm-hmm. All of that for a truly humane and inclusive society that's determined to be compassionate and treat all of their citizens equally, that should be what we're striving for. So this bill is seeking to, it's very narrowly framed. It's looking solely at abortion for disability and saying across the political parties in Northern Ireland, there is support for a rejection of disability discrimination pre-birth. So I think it's a really good move forward to just put a line in the sand and say no to discriminating against these children purely because they've been diagnosed pre-birth with some sort of impairment.
Now, Dawn, you and I, we've been involved in pro-life for quite some time. We know our people, and they know us. There will be some people who will be very uncomfortable with the idea of any kind of partial legislation, a sense that maybe it recognizes the rest of it, or it's cooperating with it, or evil, and will say no, this is not the way to go. We can't do this piecemeal. How would you speak to them?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. I would say for Paul Given himself, he has been a phenomenal pro-life supporter and advocate for many years. So I think you look at the person who's bringing forward the bill as well, if you're concerned from a pro-life perspective.
Yeah.
And then you set the bigger abortion question to the side, and you think this is something we can do right here, right now. And I was talking to somebody just last week, and I said, you know, we all want the same thing. We all want to see a restoration of lost protections for every unborn baby and for women who are hurt by abortion. But if you have a lifeboat and there's 100 people in the water, and you know you can only save 5, but you know that you can save 5, do you not save the 5 because you can't save the 100? You know, so for me, this is not about an either or. It's not about if we support this bill, we then are supporting all the other abortions. It's not that at all. It's saying this is disability discrimination. It's inhumane. It's not acceptable in 2021 in a modern, supposedly progressive, civilized country. We're going to reject that prenatal disability discrimination. And at the same time, we're still looking to restore all of the other lost protections.
Of course. So in a sense, you're saying we should not let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
No, absolutely not. And actually, if you don't support this bill, you're sending a message that you support abortion for disability. You know, so the argument could be made both ways. I would encourage everybody to support this bill. Now,
we know Sinn Fein, this is an ideological thing for them. They ignored the votes in Stormont. They ignored the marches. They ignored the petitions. I'm right in saying that, I mean, there have been consistent polling which has shown that people in the north of Ireland don't want the regime that was operating in the rest of the United Kingdom.
Yes, do you know, polling's a funny one, isn't it? Because
of course, yes, it's not the same
question that you ask, but yes, from our observation, the polling showed that the majority of people were against Westminster imposing anything on Northern Ireland. The majority of people, when asked about the 67 Act in GB, and that has led to a place where now over 200,000 babies have been terminated in those 52 years. The majority of people in Northern Ireland would recoil with horror at those statistics. But then they were swayed by the arguments for the extreme circumstances.
Always the extreme.
Start asking questions about choice framed in compassion, then people, you know, sort of, yeah, it's not a clear cut, you know.
Slight abandoned misdirection kind of thing.
Yes.
We know Sinn Fein they're committed to this. This is part of their, as I said, even to the extent that they're willing to accept direct rule from Westminster rather than devolve to government in the province. That there you go. The DUP is pretty well on the record. The DUP is a pro-life party. It's not to the point, I suppose, but the last year I've been very slightly, to be honest with you, amused. I talked to 3 different friends of mine who from the north, and who have been voting DUP, And they said that they're rather afraid that their granny or their granddad is going to come out of the grave. And in fact, but they said they did understand, actually, because they were the only they're very committed Roman Catholics, but and as such they're pro-lifers. And they said that this for them is the single biggest issue for the, and it's a very strange politics that's evolving. The SDLP, I suppose, without going through all the parties, what chance do you think this legislation has of going through?
We are realistically hopeful. A motion was passed in the Assembly in June 2020. The DUP put forward a motion which rejected abortion for a fetal disability diagnosis. And it had a second part that rejected Westminster's imposition of the abortion regime. Sinn Fein then put forward an amendment where they rejected abortion for disability, but they didn't want to reject the broader imposition of abortion legislation. And they, talking about women's rights, etc. But it shows that there's common ground between Sinn Fein and the DUP on the disability discrimination issue. And then when you look at the other parties, there's cross-party support with the Ulster Unionists, with Alliance, and with the SDLP. That would be a conscience vote, but individuals within those parties would support this motion, would support this bill. The motion itself, the Sinn Féin amendment, was rejected, but the motion passed, and that was a cross-party pass. Okay. So we would be realistically hopeful that our Assembly would send a strong message which is against disability discrimination and for equality of opportunity for unborn babies, who of course then will be born children living with disabilities and their families.
Well done, your mouth to God's ear, and I hope that maybe we can come back and talk to you again sometime soon on the back of a success, and maybe that the people of Northern Ireland can send a message out and be a beacon for the rest of us. But for today, I would like to thank Dawn for talking to us. It's been really interesting. I'd like to thank our listeners and our viewers here. Again, I'd remind you, if you can click on the subscribe button, or again, if you can help us in our campaigns, working both in North and South. And as you know, we're working on many life campaigns here with euthanasia coming up, being promoted at the moment. We need your help on that, so if you can do that, that would be great. But for the time being, thank you again, Dawn, and thank you all for joining us. So stay safe out there and wash your hands.